Okay, today we are in lesson 12. Last week we talked about the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus and the trials that followed. This week we begin with the crucifixion. And question number 1 says, describe the scene at the cross as John saw it. John makes no attempt to describe the process of crucifixion, probably because it was well known to the readers and he didn't want to dwell on the physical horrors of the cross. He mentions that Jesus was crucified with 2 others, one on each side. John describes the placard that was written in 3 languages: Aramaic for the local inhabitants, Latin for the officials, and Greek, which was the common language of the world in that day. The placard said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." This is what Pilate instructed to be written on it. It seems that it was his revenge on the Jewish hierarchy for forcing him to go through with this execution. This upset the Jews, and they tried to get him to change it, but he said, "What I have written, I have written." Verses 23 and 24 discusses the clothing of Jesus. Usually the clothing of a crucified man became the property of the executioners. The text indicates that Jesus had 5 pieces of clothing. We know this because they divided up 4 pieces and then had 1 left. This would have been a turban or a headdress, an outer robe, a sash, and sandals. We are told that these 4 items again were divided among the 4 soldiers, and then the 5th item was an undergarment, and it would have been a fairly long tunic woven in 1 piece. It would have been no value if they had cut it into 4 parts. So the 4 soldiers decided to gamble for this piece of clothing. John's reasoning for mentioning this was Jesus' fulfillment of the prophecy of Psalm 22. This is quoted in verse 24, which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Question 2 says, who stood at the foot of the cross, and what did they hear? John mentions 4 women and 1 man. The women were Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and his mother's sister, who was presumably Salome, the mother of James and John. The man is identified as the writer himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which again is understood to have been the Apostle John. The first thing mentioned that they heard was Jesus transferring the care of his mother over to John the Apostle. Jesus then said he was thirsty, and he was given vinegar to drink, which was probably the cheap sour wine that the legionnaires drank. Then in verse 30, Jesus said, "It is finished." This signified the completion of his work. This act was voluntary and confident. He had carried out perfectly the Father's purpose, and he was triumphantly leaving the scene of his human struggle. It was a victory statement, not a statement of defeat. Question 3 says, why did the soldiers intend to break the legs of Jesus? Romans usually left the bodies of criminals on the crosses as a warning to potential offenders, but Jewish law prohibited the practice of leaving hanged bodies overnight. In order to hasten the death, the soldiers broke the legs of those who were still living. The only way a crucified man could obtain a full breath of air was to raise himself up by pushing up with his legs. If his legs were broken, his death would follow quickly because of lack of oxygen. The next section discusses the burial. The question is asked, what did Joseph of Arimathea ask of Pilate? Joseph asked Pilate for permission to remove Jesus' body, which would have included burying his body. This was an admission that he was friends with Jesus. Up to this point, Joseph had been a secret believer, but now he was openly confessing his faith. Question 2 says, how did Nicodemus assist Joseph of Arimathea? Verse 39 mentions that Nicodemus brought about 100 pounds of a mixture of myrrh and aloes. Some translations say this was about 75 pounds. A large quantity of these showed Nicodemus' wealth, and it showed his appreciation of Jesus. Myrrh is a gum that's prized for its perfume. Aloe is a fragrant spice. And when aloe is used with myrrh, it acts as a drying agent, and the fragrance would counteract the odor of the decaying flesh. Question 3 says, how does John describe the burial place of Jesus? Let me show you here. I should have touched on this a minute ago. This is the traditional Golgotha. This is the temple area here, Temple Mount. The rest of Jerusalem on down this way. This is the Praetorium that we talked about, where Pilate was last week. And this is the traditional Golgotha and the traditional tomb here. And this is Gordon's Calvary and Garden tomb here. The different views. We don't know with absolute certainty where the location was. But anyway, question 3 is, how does John describe the burial place of Jesus? He says that the tomb was located in a garden which was close to where Jesus was crucified. The section on the resurrection, question 1, what did Mary Magdalene observe at the tomb of Jesus? Verse 1 says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and then the text says that she saw or observed that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Question 2 says, who did she tell, and what did they do? What did they see? She told Peter and John, and they both ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying there and the handkerchief that had been around Jesus' head. It was folded together in a place by itself. Question 3 asks, why did these men go to their homes? I understand this just means they went back to where they were staying, where they were lodging. Though they had reason to be concerned, I don't know if that's the implication here. We will address that in question 6. Question 4 says, who did Mary meet at the tomb, and what did they say? The text tells us that she saw 2 angels, and they asked her why she was weeping. Question 5 says, who else did she see at the tomb? It says she saw Jesus, and she was aware of his presence, but due to her distress regarding his crucifixion and now the loss of his body, she paid little attention to him. She thought he was the keeper of the garden. Then Jesus called her name, and she knew it was him. The fact that he knew her name, and no doubt once he called her name, she recognized his voice. Obviously, she was ecstatic. She then went and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord. Question 6 says, what happened on the evening of the resurrection? Verse 19 mentions that the apostles were assembled behind closed doors for fear of the Jews. This would have been true especially after what Peter had done in the garden the evening that the soldiers came and arrested Jesus. And now that Jesus' body was mentioning when it had been under guard by the authorities, they obviously had reason to be concerned. But Jesus appeared in the room, and the implication seems clear that Jesus was not impeded by locked doors. Question 7 says, who had to learn about this event from others? And that would be Thomas. Question number 8 says, what happened 1 week later? We're told that the apostles were gathered together again with the doors shut. And just like the previous week, Jesus appeared and stood in their midst and said, peace be with you. Then Jesus used the same words that Thomas had spoken in his unbelief when he was just with the disciples and Jesus was not present. And so Jesus invited Thomas to touch him, to handle him. Consequently, Thomas expressed full faith in Jesus. For a Jew to call another person my Lord and my God is quite incredible. The Jewish law was strictly monotheistic, meaning belief in one God. So to call any man God was clearly blasphemy. This is exactly why John wrote this gospel, which is addressed in the next question. That is, what was produced in Thomas when he saw Jesus. That's why John wrote this gospel. Question 9, why did John write this account of the gospel? Verse 31 says, in verse 31 rather, John said, he wrote these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. That brings us to next week's assignment, which is the epilogue, section 8, Roman numeral 8, and it'll be chapter 21.